The Galactic Concordance had ruled the stars for 10,000 years, and in all that time, they had never once considered humanity a threat. They looked at the small pink creatures from the blue planet and saw nothing special, nothing dangerous, nothing worth respecting. Humans bled too easily, broke too quickly, and died from wounds that other species would simply walk away from. So when humanity asked for the third time to join the Concordance military forces, the Council decided to end the conversation forever. They would accept one human into the Velthari Combat Academy, the most brutal training program in the known galaxy, and when that human died screaming on some frozen moon or burning desert, the matter would be settled. No more requests, no more petitions, no more annoying persistence from the soft little Deathworlders who did not know their place. Lieutenant Commander Alara Vance received the news on a Tuesday morning in a gray military office that smelled like old coffee and recycled air. She was 32 years old with short dark hair and eyes that had seen things she never talked about. Her service record was classified at levels that made senior officers uncomfortable, and her body carried scars from 6 continents and 2 off-world deployments. When her commanding general told her she had been selected as humanity's representative to the Alien Combat Academy, she simply nodded once and asked when she was leaving. "You understand what this means," the general said, leaning forward across his desk with worry creasing his forehead. "They are sending you there to die, Alara, and they want us to watch it happen." "I understand, sir." The survival rate for their own species is barely 60%, and those are beings with armored skin and the ability to breathe poison. So what chance do you think they believe a human has? Alara looked at him with those quiet, steady eyes that never seemed to blink at the wrong moment. "Permission to speak freely, sir." "Granted." "They have made a mistake," she said simply. "They looked at us and saw weakness because we are small and soft and breakable, but they forgot to ask why we are still here." The general stared at her for a long moment before a small smile crossed his weathered face. "Give them hell, Lieutenant Commander." "I intend to, sir." 3 weeks later, Alara stood on the observation deck of the Concordance transport ship and watched the stars blur past at speeds her ancestors could never have imagined. The other passengers avoided her, clustering in groups and speaking in languages that clicked and hissed and rumbled like distant thunder. She counted 14 different species on the ship, and every single one of them towered over her small human frame. The Vraxians were the largest, standing nearly 3 meters tall with hard chitinous plates covering their bodies and mandibles that could crush stone. The Torvans moved like liquid shadow, their scales shifting colors as they walked, and their eyes glowing with infrared vision that could track prey in total darkness. The Sindari breathed through gill-like slits, and their ancestors had evolved on a world where the very air would burn human lungs to ash. And then there was Alara, 165 centimeters of soft pink skin and fragile bones, and a heartbeat that any of them could stop with a single careless blow. She felt their stares like heat on her back as she stood at the window, but she did not turn around. Let them look, she thought. Let them see exactly what they expected to see. The transport docked at an orbital station above a planet called Kethros 9, and Alara felt the temperature change the moment she stepped off the ship. The station was kept warm for the cold-blooded species, nearly 40 degrees by human standards, and sweat immediately began to prickle along her spine. She ignored it the same way she had ignored the heat in 3 different deserts on Earth, the same way she had ignored frostbite in the Arctic, the same way she had ignored pain and exhaustion and fear for her entire adult life. The candidates were assembled in a massive circular chamber with walls of dark metal and a floor that thrummed with the vibration of distant engines. 60 beings stood in rough formation, and Alara took her place at the end of the last row where she could see everyone and no one could stand behind her. A door hissed open at the far end of the chamber, and silence fell like a hammer. The being who entered was Vraxian, but older and more scarred than any of the others, with one eye socket empty and dark, and a pattern of ritual marks burned into his chest plates. He walked with the confidence of someone who had killed more times than he could count, and expected to kill many more before he was done. "I am Commandant Threkvor," he said in a voice like grinding metal, "and I am here to tell you that most of you will not survive what comes next." His single eye swept across the assembled candidates and stopped when it reached Alara. She felt the weight of that gaze like a physical pressure, but she did not look away. "The Velthari Academy exists to forge warriors worthy of defending the Concordance," Threkvor continued, still staring at her. "It is not a school, it is not a test, it is a crucible that burns away everything weak and leaves only strength behind." He began to walk along the rows of candidates, his heavy footsteps echoing in the silent chamber. "Some of you come from worlds where the air is poison and the gravity would crush lesser beings. And some of you come from worlds where every creature is a predator and survival is measured in hours rather than years." He stopped directly in front of Alara and looked down at her from his immense height. "And some of you," he said softly, "come from soft worlds with gentle climates and easy prey, and you have somehow convinced yourselves that you belong here." Alara met his eye without flinching. "Nature has a way of correcting such mistakes," Threkvor said, and something that might have been amusement flickered across his alien features. "The unworthy are always culled in the end." He turned and walked back to the front of the chamber, dismissing her as easily as he might dismiss an insect. "Training begins at dawn," he announced to the assembly. "I suggest you use the time to make peace with whatever gods your species worship." The candidates were dismissed to their quarters, and Alara walked through corridors filled with beings who looked at her like she was already dead. She found her room, a small bare space with a sleeping platform and a single window that looked out at the burning orange planet below. She stood at that window for a long time, watching the storms that raged across the surface of Kethros 9, and she thought about all the ways this place was designed to kill her. Then she began to plan. The dropship screamed through the atmosphere of Kethros 9 like a burning meteor, and Alara gripped her restraints as the temperature inside the cabin climbed higher with every passing second. Her squad consisted of 5 candidates thrown together by random assignment or perhaps by design. 2 Vraxians sat across from her, their mandibles clicking in what she had learned was contemptuous laughter, and they had not spoken a single word to her since the briefing. A Torvan named Vrethka lounged in the corner seat with his scales shifting through shades of orange and red, and his slitted eyes watched her with the lazy attention of a predator who was not yet hungry. The 5th member of their squad was a Sindari named Kethra, smaller than the others and younger too, with silver-blue scales and gill slits that fluttered nervously as the ship shook and rattled. She was the only one who had looked at Alara without obvious hatred or amusement, and Alara filed that information away for later. "Listen carefully," the pilot's voice crackled through the speakers. "You will be dropped in the scorched valley with water for 3 days and rations for 1, and your objective is simple." The ship banked hard, and Alara felt her stomach lurch. "Survive for 2 weeks and reach the extraction point on the northern ridge, and anyone who fails to arrive will be considered dead whether they are or not." The rear door began to open, and a wall of heat slammed into the cabin like a physical blow. Alara had trained in the Sahara Desert and the salt flats of Death Valley, but Kethros 9 made those places feel like gentle spring mornings. The air that rushed in was thick with dust and tasted like copper and ash, and the ground below glowed orange under a sky the color of dried blood. "Move," one of the Vraxians barked, and he shoved Alara toward the door with enough force to send her stumbling. She caught her balance and jumped without hesitation, falling 10 meters to land in a roll that left her coated in fine red sand. The others followed, the Vraxians landing with heavy thuds that cracked the baked earth beneath their feet. The dropship was gone before the dust settled, climbing back toward orbit and leaving them alone in a landscape that seemed designed by something that hated life. "The human will slow us down," the larger Vraxian said immediately, turning to his companion with his mandibles spread in what Alara recognized as a sneer. "Then we leave her behind," the other agreed. "She can serve as distraction for predators while we move ahead." Vrethka the Torvon flicked his tongue and tasted the air. "There is something hunting nearby," he said casually. "I can taste blood on the wind, something that has killed recently and will want to kill again soon." Kethra the Sindari moved closer to Alara almost unconsciously, her gill slits fluttering with anxiety. "We should stay together," she said quietly. "The briefing said the predators here hunt in packs." The Vraxians ignored her and began walking north without another word, their armored bodies moving with surprising speed despite their bulk. Vrethka followed after a moment, his scales shifting to match the red-orange colors of the landscape, and soon he was nearly invisible against the terrain. "Come on," Alara said to Kethra, and she began to jog after the others. The first day passed in a haze of heat and thirst, and the constant awareness of movement at the edges of her vision. Alara watched everything, cataloging the way certain patches of sand shifted when no wind was blowing, noting the patterns of small holes that dotted the ground near rock formations, tracking the flight paths of the leathery-winged creatures that circled overhead. The Vraxians set a brutal pace, never stopping, never resting, seemingly immune to the heat that was slowly cooking Alara from the inside out. But she kept up, drawing on reserves of stubbornness that had carried her through hell before, and she noticed that Kethra was struggling even more than she was. The Sindari's scales had lost their silver sheen and turned a dull gray, and her breathing came in ragged gasps through those delicate gill slits. "You need water," Alara said quietly as they walked. "I have already drunk my share for today." "Take some of mine." Kethra looked at her with something like confusion in her large dark eyes. "Why would you help me? We are competitors, not allies." "Because you might help me someday," Alara said simply, "and because I do not leave people behind." That night they made camp in the shadow of a rock formation that provided some shelter from the wind, and the Vraxians finally acknowledged Alara's existence long enough to inform her that she would take the first watch. She did not argue, simply settling into a comfortable position where she could see in all directions, and she spent the long hours of darkness listening to the sounds of a world that wanted her dead. Sometime after midnight, she heard movement from one of the small holes she had noticed earlier, a soft scratching sound that made the hair on her arms stand up. She watched as something emerged from the sand, a creature about the size of a large dog with too many legs and mandibles that dripped with something that sizzled when it hit the ground. It moved toward the sleeping form of the larger Vraxian, attracted perhaps by his body heat or the sound of his breathing. Alara threw a rock. The creature spun toward her with a hiss, and she threw another rock that struck it directly between its cluster of eyes. It screamed, a high piercing sound that woke the others, and then it fled back into its hole. The Vraxian was on his feet with his blade drawn, looking around wildly for an enemy. "What happened? What was that sound?" "Sand burrower," Alara said calmly, "about the size of your head with venomous mandibles, and it was 2 meters from your throat before I drove it away." The Vraxian stared at her, and she could see him struggling to process what she had just said. "You saved my life, why?" "Because we are a squad," Alara said, "and squads look out for each other whether they like each other or not." He was silent for a long moment. "Perhaps you are less useless than I thought, human." "My name is Alara." "I am Korath Vel," he said slowly, as if the words cost him something, "and I will take the next watch." Alara nodded and settled down to sleep, but she kept one eye open and one hand on her knife. Trust was earned, not given, and she had a long way to go before this squad would see her as anything but prey. The next morning they found the sand burrower's nest, a massive underground chamber filled with bones from a dozen different species, and Alara realized just how close Korethvel had come to death. "On Earth," she said as they stood at the edge of the hole looking down, "we have a saying that the small things kill more people than the large ones, and we learned to never underestimate anything that can hurt us." Vrethka the Torvon looked at her with something new in his slitted eyes. "Your world has such creatures." "Our world has creatures so small you cannot see them with your eyes," Alara said, "and they have killed more humans than all our wars combined, so yes, we learned a long time ago to respect everything that wants us dead." She turned and began walking north, and this time the others fell into step beside her instead of leaving her behind. They still had 12 days to survive, but something had changed in the way they looked at her. She was no longer prey. She was a squad mate. The frozen moon of Nethvar hung in the darkness of space like a pale blue eye, and Alara stood at the window of the transport ship, watching it grow larger with every passing moment. 23 candidates had survived the trials on Kethros 9, down from the original 60, and the whispers in the corridors said that Nethvar would cut that number in half again. This was the second phase of training, individual survival, in conditions that made the burning desert look hospitable. Each candidate would be dropped alone in the frozen wilderness with nothing but a blade and a thermal blanket, and they would have to survive for one standard week, while temperatures plunged to 80 degrees below zero. "The briefing said this moon has predators that hunt by sensing body heat," Kethra said from beside her, her voice tight with fear she was trying to hide. "I read the same briefing. Alara, my species evolved on a tropical world where the coldest temperature is what you would call a warm summer day, and I have never experienced true cold in my life." Alara looked at her friend, because that was what Kethra had become over the weeks of training, and she saw the genuine terror beneath the Sindari's careful composure. "You will survive," Alara said firmly. "How can you know that?" "Because I refuse to accept any other outcome." The dropships launched an hour later, scattering the candidates across the frozen surface of Nethvar like seeds thrown into snow. Alara hit the ground rolling and came up with her blade in her hand, scanning the horizon for immediate threats. The world around her was white and gray and pale blue, an endless expanse of ice and rock beneath a sky filled with stars and the massive ringed planet that Nethvar orbited. The cold hit her immediately, a brutal crushing weight that tried to force the air from her lungs, and she pulled the thermal blanket tight around her shoulders as she began to walk. She needed to find shelter before nightfall, because night on Nethvar meant temperatures that would freeze her blood solid in minutes. Her training took over, the countless hours she had spent studying Arctic survival techniques from Earth's indigenous peoples, the Inuit and the Sami and others who had thrived in conditions that would kill most modern humans. She found a snowbank with the right consistency and began to dig, carving out a shelter that would trap her body heat and keep the wind at bay. By the time darkness fell, she was inside her snow cave with a small fire burning at the entrance, eating a handful of the edible lichens she had scraped from nearby rocks. The cold was still terrible, a constant pressure that made her muscles ache and her joints creak, but she was alive. She thought about Kethra somewhere out there on the frozen plain, alone and afraid and slowly freezing to death. "Hold on," she whispered into the darkness, "just hold on." The days blurred together in a haze of cold and hunger, and the constant need to keep moving. Alara built snares using the fibrous plants that grew beneath the ice, catching small burrowing creatures that other candidates would never have noticed. She learned to read the weather patterns in the movement of the clouds, to predict the storms that could bury a person alive in minutes. She learned the hunting patterns of the heat-sensing predators, massive white-furred beasts that moved in packs and could smell warm blood from kilometers away. On the fourth night they found her. Elara was in her snow shelter when she heard them outside, the soft crunch of heavy paws on ice and the low rumbling growls of predators who had located prey. There were at least 6 of them from the sound, circling her shelter, waiting for her to emerge. She could not fight 6 of them, and she could not run because they were faster than any human could hope to match. So she did something that went against every instinct her body possessed. She buried herself in the snow, pulled the thermal blanket over her head, and began to slow her breathing. This was a technique she had learned years ago from a meditation master in the mountains of Tibet, a way of lowering her heart rate and body temperature until she was barely alive. It was dangerous, hovering so close to death that her body might simply forget to keep fighting, but it was her only chance. She lay in the darkness beneath the snow and listened to the predators growl and scratch at the entrance to her shelter, searching for the heat signature that had suddenly vanished. Hours passed. She lost track of time, lost track of everything except the slow, steady rhythm of her heart and the absolute necessity of staying perfectly still. Eventually, just before dawn, the predators gave up and moved on. Elara emerged from the snow gasping and shaking, her body temperature dangerously low, but alive. 2 more days, she told herself, just 2 more days. On the 6th day she found Kethra. The Sindari was lying in a shallow depression in the ice. Her scales turned the color of old ash and her eyes barely open. She was hypothermic and hallucinating, calling out in her native language for someone named Veth, who might have been a parent or a lover or a childhood friend. Elara knelt beside her and felt for a pulse, finding it weak and thready beneath the cold scales. "Kethra, can you hear me? It is Elara, and I am going to help you." "Cold," Kethra whispered. "So cold I cannot feel my hands, I cannot feel anything." The extraction point was 11 kilometers to the north, and the regulations were clear that candidates could not assist one another. Failure was individual, the briefing had said, and anyone who could not reach the extraction point on their own would be marked as dead. Elara looked at those regulations and decided she did not care. She wrapped her thermal blanket around Kethra and lifted the Sindari onto her back, staggering under the weight but refusing to fall. Then she began to walk. The kilometers passed in agony, every step a battle against the wind and the cold, and the weight of her friend pressing down on her exhausted muscles. A storm hit halfway through, a howling blizzard that reduced visibility to nothing and threatened to bury them both. Elara kept walking, navigating by the stars when she could see them, and by pure stubborn refusal to stop when she could not. She fell 3 times and got up 3 times, and when her legs finally gave out, she crawled on her hands and knees through the snow. The extraction point appeared through the blizzard like a dream, a small heated shelter with lights blazing against the darkness, and Elara collapsed through the door with Kethra still on her back. The medical team rushed forward and took Kethra from her arms, and Elara lay on the floor staring at the ceiling and trying to remember how to breathe. An evaluator appeared above her, a Vraxian in formal uniform with a datapad in his clawed hands. "You violated protocol," he said coldly. "Candidates are not permitted to assist one another during individual survival trials." Elara looked up at him with eyes that had seen hell and come out the other side. "My protocol says you do not leave anyone behind," she said. "Write me up if you want, she is alive." The evaluator stared at her for a long moment, then turned and walked away without another word. Later she learned that Commandant Threkvor had been watching from the orbital station above, and that he had personally ordered the evaluator to let the matter drop. She also learned that she was one of only 12 candidates to survive Nethvar, and that Kethra would make a full recovery. When Kethra woke in the medical bay, she found Alara asleep in a chair beside her bed. "You carried me," the Sindari said softly when Alara opened her eyes. "Yes. 11 kilometers through a blizzard, even though it could have killed you, even though the rules said to leave me." "Yes." Kethra's dark eyes filled with something that might have been tears. "Why?" Alara reached out and took her friend's cold hand. "Because that is what humans do," she said simply. "We do not leave people behind." The combat station hung in orbit like a waiting predator, its dark metal hull bristling with sensor arrays and weapons emplacements that gleamed in the light of distant stars. Alara stood in the briefing room with the other surviving candidates and studied the holographic display that showed the station's layout, memorizing every corridor, every junction, every potential choke point. This was the final phase, the crucible that would determine who graduated from the Velthari Combat Academy and who went home in disgrace. The exercise was simple in concept, but brutal in execution. 2 squads would enter the station from opposite ends and fight their way to the command center, using whatever tactics they could devise to overcome automated defenses, environmental hazards, and each other. The squad that captured and held the command center would win, and the losing squad would be eliminated from the program entirely. Alara had been assigned to lead a squad of 8, a responsibility that surprised her until she realized what the evaluators were actually doing. They wanted to see if she could command beings who still looked at humans as lesser creatures, and they wanted to watch her fail. Her squad gathered around her as the briefing ended, a mix of species who had survived the previous trials through a combination of skill, luck, and sheer stubborn refusal to die. Kethra was there, her scales gleaming with health again and her eyes sharp with determination. Korethvel the Vraxian stood at her left shoulder, the same warrior whose life she had saved on Kethros 9, and his presence sent a clear message to anyone watching. 2 other Vraxians had been assigned to her squad, younger and less experienced than Korethvel, but willing to follow his lead. A Torvan named Sithrak rounded out the team, along with 2 Sindari warriors who had trained alongside Kethra. "Our opponents are led by Sethkaran," Korethvel said quietly, his mandibles clicking with what might have been concern. "I have heard that name," Alara replied, Threkvor's protege, undefeated in 12 combat evaluations. "He is the finest warrior of his generation, and his squad is composed of veterans who have served in actual combat, so our chances are not good." Alara looked at her team, seeing the doubt in their eyes, the fear that they were about to be crushed by superior opponents. "Let me tell you something about humans," she said, and her voice carried a quiet confidence that made them all lean closer. "We are not the strongest species on our planet, and we are not the fastest or the most deadly, but we are still here while countless others have gone extinct." She pulled up the station schematic on her personal display. "Do you know how we survived? We did not try to outfight the things that could kill us, instead we outthought them, and that is exactly what we are going to do today." Sethkaran expected a direct assault, she explained, because that was what Vraxian honor demanded, a glorious clash of warriors where the strong would triumph over the weak. So they would give him something else entirely. "We are going to use the station itself as a weapon," Alara said, her finger tracing pathways through the holographic maze. "These maintenance corridors are too small for Vraxians but perfect for me and the Sindari, and these ventilation shafts connect to critical systems throughout the station." She divided her squad into 3 teams, each with a specific objective that would not become clear until the final moment. "Korethvel, you will lead the main force directly toward the command center and make as much noise as possible, because Sethkaran needs to believe you are our entire strategy." "You want me to be a distraction," the Vraxian said, and there was no offense in his voice, only understanding. "I want you to be a threat he cannot ignore, and while he is focused on you, The rest of us will be taking the station apart around him." The exercise began with a warning klaxon that echoed through the empty corridors, and Alara's squad moved out with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Korathvel's team pushed forward aggressively, engaging the automated defenses with brutal efficiency, and leaving a trail of destruction that Sethkaran's scouts would have no trouble following. Meanwhile, Alara led Kethra and the other Sindari through the narrow maintenance passages, crawling through spaces that would have been impossible for the larger species. They moved in silence, planting small charges at key points along their route, nothing powerful enough to cause serious damage, but more than sufficient to create chaos when triggered. Sithrak the Torvan had the most dangerous job, infiltrating the station's environmental controls and waiting for Alara's signal. The two forces met in the corridors outside the command center, and Alara watched through a security camera she had hacked as Sethkaran confronted Korathvel. The undefeated warrior was everything his reputation suggested, massive even by Vraxian standards, with ceremonial scars covering his chest plates and eyes that burned with the joy of combat. "Where is the human?" Sethkaran demanded, his voice carrying through the corridor like thunder. "Leading this squad," Korathvel replied calmly, "though I doubt you would believe me if I told you what that means." "It means nothing. You are fools following a creature who should not even be here, and I will crush you and prove once again that the weak have no place among warriors." Alara triggered the first charge. The explosion rocked the corridor and filled it with smoke, and in the confusion Korathvel's team retreated according to plan, drawing Sethkaran's forces after them. "Now," Alara said into her communicator. The lights went out as Sithrak cut power to the section, and in the darkness, Alara and the Sindari emerged from the maintenance hatches and slipped past the enemy forces like ghosts. They reached the command center door to find it guarded by a single warrior, a young Vraxian who never saw Alara coming until her blade was at his throat. "Surrender," she said quietly, "and I will not hurt you." He surrendered. Inside the command center, Alara moved to the main terminal and began uploading the virus she had prepared during the briefing, a simple program that would lock down the station's systems and prevent anyone from overriding her control. Sethkaran realized his mistake too late, charging back toward the command center with his remaining forces, only to find the doors sealed against him. Alara opened a communication channel and saw his face appear on the screen, twisted with rage and disbelief. "This is impossible," he snarled. "You are one human with a handful of lesser warriors. How could you have defeated me?" "You were so focused on the obvious threat that you forgot to check for the small things," Alara said calmly. "On my planet, the most dangerous creatures are often the ones you never see coming." The station's speakers crackled to life as the evaluation coordinators announced that the exercise was over, and Alara's squad had achieved victory. Sethkaran stared at her through the screen for a long moment, and something shifted in his eyes, something that might have been the first grudging acknowledgement that he had underestimated her. "You did not defeat me in combat," he said finally. "No," Alara agreed. "I made combat irrelevant, because that is what humans do when we cannot win by force, and that is what your instructors should have warned you about." She closed the channel and turned to find her squad watching her, with expressions she had never seen before. Respect, she realized. Genuine, unqualified respect from beings who had spent their entire lives believing humans were nothing but soft targets. "We won," Kethra said softly, as if she could not quite believe it. "We won," Alara confirmed, and for the first time since she had arrived at the academy, she allowed herself to smile. The graduation ceremony was held in the Grand Assembly Hall of the Concordance's capital station, a massive domed chamber that could hold 10,000 beings, and was broadcast live to over 100 worlds. 11 candidates stood in formation on the ceremonial platform, each one wearing the formal uniform of the Velthari Combat Academy, and each one bearing the scars of trials that had killed so many others. Alara stood at the center of the line, the first and only human to ever reach this moment, and she felt the weight of 100 billion watching eyes pressing down on her shoulders. The audience filled every seat in the Great Hall, representatives from every species in the concordance who had come to witness what many still believed was impossible. Commandant Threkvor approached the platform with slow ceremonial steps, his single eye fixed on Alara in a way that made her spine straighten reflexively. He carried a branding iron in his massive claws, the tip glowing white-hot, and Alara knew what was coming next. The mark of completion was a tradition older than the Academy itself, a final test of pain tolerance that proved a graduate's commitment to the warrior path. One by one, Threkvor pressed the brand into the shoulders of the graduating candidates, and one by one, they accepted the pain without flinching, without making a sound. Then he stood before Alara, and the entire hall fell silent. "Lieutenant Commander Vance," he said, his voice carrying through speakers to every corner of the chamber, "you have completed the trials of the Velthari Combat Academy with a tactical evaluation score higher than any candidate in 40 cycles." The words hung in the air, and Alara heard the murmur of shock that rippled through the audience. "You have demonstrated survival skills that surprised our instructors, leadership abilities that unified beings who should have been your enemies, and strategic thinking that defeated warriors bred for combat across 1,000 generations." He raised the branding iron, and Alara could feel the heat radiating from its glowing tip. "Do you accept the mark of the Velthari?" "I do." The brand pressed into her shoulder, and the pain was immediate and absolute, a searing fire that burned through her skin and into the muscle beneath. Alara did not flinch. She did not make a sound. She simply met Threkvor's eye and held his gaze, while the smell of her own burning flesh filled her nostrils. When he pulled the brand away, the old Vraxian leaned close enough that only she could hear him speak. "You were supposed to die," he said quietly. "That was the entire purpose of bringing you here." "I know," Alara replied, her voice steady despite the pain still pulsing through her shoulder. "That was the point, was it not? Send the human to prove we do not belong." Threkvor was silent for a long moment, his single eye searching her face for something she could not identify. "What are you?" he asked finally. Alara smiled, a small tired expression that carried the weight of every scar and every loss and every impossible survival her species had ever achieved. "We are Deathworlders too, Commandant. We just learned to hide it." She stepped past him and turned to face the assembly, her voice rising to fill the great hall. "Our world tried to kill us every day for 200,000 years, and it never stopped trying, not once, not for a single generation." The audience watched in silence as this small pink creature spoke with a confidence that seemed to fill the entire chamber. "We survived ice ages that covered our planet in glaciers for 10,000 years, and we survived plagues that killed half our population in a single season, and we survived predators that could tear us apart with a single swipe of their claws." She began to walk along the platform, her eyes moving across the assembled representatives of 100 worlds. "We did not evolve armor because we learned to make it ourselves, and we did not evolve venom because we learned to make poisons that would make your deadliest creatures weep, and we did not evolve claws because we learned to make weapons that can crack a planet in half." Her voice dropped lower, but somehow it carried even further. "What we evolved was stubbornness, the absolute refusal to accept that anything in the universe has the right to kill us. And what we evolved was spite, the burning need to prove wrong everyone who ever said we could not survive." She stopped in the center of the platform and faced the audience directly. "You designed this program to break the weak, and you thought humans would shatter because we look soft, because we bleed easily, Because we die from things your species would shrug off without a second thought. The silence in the hall was absolute. But you measured the wrong things. Alara's voice rose with every word. You did not measure persistence, the ability to keep moving forward when every cell in your body is begging you to stop, and you did not measure adaptability. The willingness to change everything about yourself to survive just one more day. She pointed at the audience, at the cameras, at everyone watching across 100 worlds. You did not measure the ability to look at something that should kill you and say, "Not today, not ever, not while I still have breath in my lungs and spite in my heart." Kethra stood among the graduates, her scales still bearing the frostbite scars from Nethvar, and tears were running down her face. Korathvel stood at rigid attention, his mandibles pressed tight together in what Alara had learned was the Vraxian expression of deep emotion. Even Seth Karan was watching from the audience, his eyes fixed on her with something that might have been respect or might have been the beginning of understanding. "You wanted to teach me a lesson about my place in the galaxy," Alara said, her voice filling the great hall one final time. "I hope you were taking notes because the lesson was this." She paused, letting the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. "Humans do not break, we adapt, we endure, and we remember." She turned and walked toward the exit, her footsteps echoing in the stunned silence. "We remember everything." The doors closed behind her, and the galaxy watched. And for the first time in 10,000 years, the Concordants understood exactly what kind of species had come knocking at their door. 6 months later, the Concordance faced its first major crisis in a century, an invasion by a hostile force from beyond the galactic rim that had already destroyed 3 border systems and was advancing faster than anyone could stop. The Council convened an emergency session and debated for 3 days before finally doing something they had never done in their entire history. They formally requested humanity's assistance. Alara received the transmission on Earth where she had been quietly training the next generation of human candidates, reading their files and selecting the ones who had that spark of stubborn defiance that could not be taught, only recognized. She read the message twice, then smiled that same small, tired smile she had worn in the graduation hall. "Well," she said to the young officers assembled before her, "it seems the galaxy finally has a use for us." She began making calls, reaching out to contacts across human space, mobilizing forces that the Concordants had never even known existed. Humanity was going to war. And this time they would not be fighting alone. The lesson was not over. It was just beginning.